So first up is Neyran Turan, who is an architect and an assistant professor at the Rice University School of Architecture. She received her doctoral degree from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and her work focuses on contemporary interpretations of scale, infrastructure, and ecology, and their potential for new positionings in architecture and urbanism. Next will be Rania Gusson. She is an assistant professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Planning, and is a partner in the collaborative practice Design Earth. So she too received her doctorate in design from Harvard, and her current project focuses on technological systems such as energy, trash, and agriculture as objects of inquiry into our ideas and practices of the urban environment. The third will be Gretchen Bakke. There. She did her doctoral work at the University of Chicago and is an assistant professor of anthropology at McGill University. Her research and teaching interests are at the intersection of art and technology in Eastern Europe and the United States. And fourth, we'll have a dual presentation, which will be a real challenge for 20 minutes. James Elliott. Jim Elliott is a professor of sociology at Rice. He arrived here a couple years ago after having taught at the University of Oregon, and Tulane University. And his early research focused primarily on urban development and social inequality, with an emphasis on racial, ethnic, and gender stratification. And the more recent research incorporates the growing emphasis on urban and environmental change. Kyle Shelton, co-presenter, is an urban and environmental historian and a postdoctoral fellow at Rice University's Kinder Institute for Urban Research. He received his PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin and is working on a book on infrastructural citizenship in Houston since 1950. And our fifth and final presentation will be by Jenny Carlson, who is a visiting assistant professor of anthropology at Southwestern University and a visiting research fellow at Rice University's SENS Center. She holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, and her research focuses on energy transitions and their repercussions for politics in Germany. All right, so quick reminder, be jotting down your questions for each person as we go, and without further ado.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Randall and Dominic, for inviting me. It's a true pleasure to be here. I'm on the privileged group of friends and colleagues who are working in the field of energy and humanities. As Randall mentioned, I'm an architect by training, and as a scholar and practitioner of architecture, I feel extremely lucky to be among this generous interdisciplinary setting, and look forward to hearing more about everyone's work. For the past few months, I've been part of the university-wide environmental studies working group led by Dominic, and I'm eager to work with many of the colleagues here as well to bring more awareness to issues of ecology, environment, and energy in Holland at Rice. So what I will present to you today is a research and exhibition project that I am currently working on, which looks at the research geographies at the Bosphorus Strait, Istanbul. The research started as a doctoral dissertation that I submitted to Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and currently I have been developing part of that research into a publication and exhibition. Before I present that material though, I will start by giving an introductory framework to this research, and we'll focus on the specifics after that. My work focuses on the relationship between geography and design broadly, to open up new aesthetic and political lines of inquiry within architecture and urbanism. Here, rather than seeing geography's potential merely as an analytical tool of description or just an expansion of scale, my work aims at developing a renewed dialogue between aesthetics and engagement for architecture, one that is committed to engage with the city and the environment in its full extent, yet is equally rigorous for the specificities of architecture as a discipline. Aligned with these interests, my early work focused on particular interactions between geography and geometry. Through, for instance, a study of the energy landscapes of the North Sea during the 1960s to historicize the relations of oil and space, while mapping some of its physical, social, and representational geographies at a transnational context. Broader ambition of that research was to reframe the domain of the spatial and the territorial through the study of what I called latent landscapes, landscapes that lied outside of ecology's focus on the natural or the wilderness on the one hand, and of urbanism's focus on the city. Because of their invisibility, basically, but they played a central role in the production and conception of what is known to us as the built environment. As an alternative to much of the pervasive discussions of interconnectivity through transnational flows and networks that were very dominant at the time I was doing the research aimed to dwell instead on the idea of territory, as set through its limits and borders. Beyond data mapping or making just invisible networks visible, what was compelling about the study of this resource territory for me as an architect was that, much like an urban or building plan, the lines, the curves, the grids, and the blocks were drawn on the surface of the sea in order to give it an organizational form. Like architecture, territory was about constructing an inside and an outside, not just about producing fluidity and connectivity. By rendering the infrastructural characteristics of the grid at the territorial scale of a transnational sea, this research portrayed the sea landscape as a primitive form of contestation between geography and geometry, between scale and form. And my research articulated design's environmental agency and its appropriate scales of intervention in that context. This question of design agency was an important instigator for the new Geographies project, a journal publication that I started at the Harvard Graduate School of Design a couple of years ago with a few other colleagues, among which is Rania, who's going to be presenting right after me, among some other few other colleagues. I have been a founding editor of the journal and acted as the chief editor of its first 2 volumes. Proposing the emergence of a geographic paradigm in design today, the journal has aimed to examine the extended environmental agency of the designer within our contemporary culture. The first volume of New Geographies, which I edited, aimed to set the terms and lay the general themes of the journal in relation to changing scales and role of design. And the second volume, titled After Zero, which I co-edited with Stephen Ramos, pointed out the challenges and possibilities of environmental economic crises for architecture. From the zero carbon to the cities built from scratch or from zero in the Persian Gulf and the south of Asia, this issue of the journal aimed to shift the focus on the provocations regarding the future, meaning the after zero. In his seminal 1967 study on the history of geographical ideas, geographer Clarice Blacken writes that there have been 3 main geographic ideas since the ancient Greece: the idea of a designed Earth, the idea of environmental influence, and the idea of human as a geographic agent. More recently, this question is provided with an alternative narrative by the idea of the Anthropocene. While extending the geological time marked by the decisive human terraforming of the Earth's surface, humans are now discussed as not only geographic, but also geological agents. Correspondingly, reminding perhaps parallels with the 1960s and the 70s, contemporary conceptualization of the environment and the spatial conceptualization of the Earth's surface in parallel at a planetary scale are constantly reshaped and filtered through 2 reciprocal attitudes. On the one hand, we are constantly presented with managerial overtones of a governable environment with systemic technofixes, a phenomenon critiqued and I think illustrated beautifully, for instance, by people like Mike Poon, a geographer studying the social repercussions of climate change. On the other hand, we are constantly confronted with the narratives of crises and apocalyptic catastrophism and so on. In parallel, like it is in the other fields, in architecture and urbanism, related ideas of resource and environmental management are reappearing with an over-reliance mostly on the positivist knowledge of expertise and a sister concept data. Within the pervasive topic of sustainability, however, these limited interpretations of environment data, one would argue, are problematic. As argued by architecture scholar Laura Kurgan, the word data means nothing more or less than representations, delegates, or emissaries of reality. Not presentations of the things themselves, but representations, figures, mediations, subject to all the conventions and aesthetics and rhetorics that we have come to expect of our images and narratives. All data, then, are not empirical, not irreducible fact about the world, but exist at not quite or almost alongside the world. They are para-empirical. To put it another way, there's no such thing as raw data. My recent work takes on this problem directly and aims to further develop a focus on the problem through the idea of what I call the geographic object. The inquiry sets itself as an alternative to the positivistic tone of environmental efficiencies that inform much of the architecture thinking today. According to this formulation, geographic becomes a political and aesthetic project about a new kind of materialism, which couples an inquiry of matter with its seemingly opposite counterparts like representation, monumentality, or composition. A recent and witty, I might say, project titled Museum of Lost Volumes, as you see on the screen, speculates on this relationship. As a geo-architecture fiction, the project speculates on the preservation of geographic ruins that once belonged to the resource extraction of rare earth minerals mining. Since the rare earth minerals are the backbone substance that's used in clean energy technologies such as wind turbines, electric batteries, and solar panels, the project questions the idea of resource scarcity in the abundance of green technologies. It imagines a museum of ancient resource extraction ruins for a time when mining is an obsolete practice and treated similarly to an ancient monument or an extinct species to be housed in a museum. Here you're seeing some of that. So, and the project I would like to talk about today takes this prompt as a starting point. It complicates the relationship between raw data and matter in the context of the resource geographies of the Bosphorus Strait, and speculates on the histories and projections of this imaginary potential. In March 1994, a dramatic accident occurred in the Bosphorus Strait of Istanbul. A 100,000 ton oil tanker carrying crude oil from Russia collided with a cargo ship at the northern exit of the strait. The cargo ship exploded and ran ashore, while the oil tanker immediately caught fire and released over 13,000 tons of oil spill into the sea. The fire continued for weeks, causing a devastating environmental disaster. 27 crew members lost their lives, and the spills continued for a week. Except for the hundreds of smaller ones, this was the second major oil tanker accident in the Bosphorus since the independent accident of 1979, which you see on the screen. While the damages caused by the 79 accident were even more devastating, the 1994 accident's impact was much wider because of its political context. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening of the Caspian oil reserves in the 90s, the strait became one of the 6 busiest oil shipping choke points in the world, along with the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca, el-Mandab, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Straits of Dover. Although the legal disputes between Russia and the new post-Soviet states over the right to exploit Caspian oil and gas resources had already created regional conflicts in countries like Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan, equally pressing geopolitical questions emerged regarding new transportation routes from this line along the sea, which is the Caspian Sea. The European Union, the United States, the multinational energy companies were all interested in the opportunities offered by the Caspian Sea resources. Although the Bosphorus Strait has been an energy corridor for oil products exported from the Batumi port through the Suez Canal in East Asia since the 19th century, what made current tanker transportation crucial was its extreme density, estimated to be 3 times busier than the Suez Canal and 4 times busier than the Panama Canal. 5% of the world's total sea trade oil passed through the Bosphorus in 2002. Compared to the other routes, however, the Bosphorus Strait has stood unique by being one of the most narrowest while passing through the heart of Istanbul, a city of 14 million citizens. What complicated the matter further was the geographic form of the Bosphorus Strait, with its sharp and narrow turns, making it one of the most riskiest and difficult channels to navigate in the world. To navigate the curves, vessels had to change their courses at least 12 times, with a maximum angle of 80 degrees, and 4 of these turns are blind corners, meaning approaching vessels cannot be seen until it's too late. In the meantime, the risks associated with oil tanker accidents were considered to be serious. The potential consequences of a tanker explosion at the channel have been even compared to an atomic bomb or an 11 Richter scale earthquake reaching 50 kilometers in diameter. Situated at the heart of the city as a twisting extraterritorial spine, the Bosphorus Strait was unsettling for Turkey. Arguing against this total ecological nightmare, quote, from an environmental standpoint, Turkey was clearly opposed to the use of the Bosphorus as a transit route for Caspian oil. Turkey's environmental minister declared during the 90s, quote, "No country has the right to engender the lives of 10 million people just because it wants to sell oil. We will never allow our sea lanes to return into oil pipelines." Although international straits like the Bosphorus are typically governed by the 1982 United Nations Law of the Sea, this law does not apply in Istanbul because of the terms of the Montreux Convention of the 30s, which guarantees the free passage of vessels through the straits. That is why Turkey could neither interfere with the transit of the tankers nor ban the transport of hazardous materials according to the law of the sea. However, the law also allows for safety measures by states bordering an international strait mediated by the consultancy of international maritime organizations such as pollution and fishing regulations. Immediately after the 94 accident, Turkey evoked the argument that it had the right to assure environmental safety of the strait for maritime traffic and introduced further controls and regulations for shipping with the support of the International Maritime Organization. Sorry, I lost my notes. Contemporary environmental concerns regarding the transit of colossal oil tankers through this navigational route, however, have been conflicted with the controversies around transnational energy pipelines and various other transnational infrastructural and urban transformation projects in Istanbul. Despite the seriousness of the risk, Turkey's push to reduce traffic passing through the strait under the banner of environmental safety was actually conspicuously related to the government's promotion of the desired BTC pipeline, Baku-Ceyhan pipeline, project as an alternative to the strait. As Turkey aimed to become an east-west energy corridor, the country has had an ongoing interest in the transport of the Caspian oil through this pipeline, which would pass through Azerbaijan and link the oil to Turkish military port of Ceyhan as an alternative to using the strait. So because of conflicting interests regarding the multiple pipeline projects and routes from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, the geopolitical significance of the Bosphorus was paramount for Turkey. Felt this way, although the BTC pipeline is an invisible and, this time literally buried, infrastructural layer physically disconnected from Istanbul, its indirect repercussions portray the wider hinterland of a resource territory. In this case, the Caspian Sea beyond its landscape of production. German sociologist Ulrich Beck warns us that, quote, "risks are not things, but social constructs that are based on the relations of power that are inscribed in a system of science and system of law, and that even the most restrained and moderate objectives encounter risk implications involves in politics." In parallel to government negotiations about the exact routing of the BTC pipeline and the recognition of the potential risk of accidents at the Bosphorus, protest campaigns, as well as conferences regarding the ecological value of the Bosphorus and the need to protect its biodiversity would multiply. Example to that would be the protest emblematic of the tone of the opposition regarding the oil tanker passage through the strait. As you see on the screen, as illustrated by World Wide Fund and the Turkish Society for the Conservation of Nature campaign poster, where the Bosphorus terrain is represented with an aggregation of matches and the tanker as a matchlock. It reads, quote, "One tanker accident in the Bosphorus Strait is enough to destroy the people, the environment, and history of Istanbul." And much recently with the controversial Istanbul Canal project, which is presented as a second Bosphorus by the Turkish government that will act as an alternative oil tanker route and an urban development zone with new cities and airports and other infrastructure projects as another very recent register to the ambivalence of risk. This under-conceptualized relationship between the geopolitical and the territorial dimension of the Bosphorus actually recalls an early moment in the 30s Istanbul, 1930s, when important changes were taking place regarding the international sovereignty relations over the same sea route as a remilitarized territory after World War I. Again, being a not yet explored episode in the urban development of the city, these geopolitical shifts of the 30s not only triggered a territorial reconceptualization of the city and its urban development, but also imparted a specific aesthetic sensibility regarding the physical geography of the Bosphorus, where the city flattened to be understood as a landscape and territory. My research explores this relationship extensively, but I'm not going to get into it because of the focus of the research geography of the 90s. In the end, the unattractive giant oil tanker passing through this fragile and narrow picturesque landscape seems to mark the irony of risk. As the number of international vehicles passing through the city has increased threefold since the 90s, their unsettling scale against this narrow strait are almost flattened to be part of the Bosphorus picturesque. Only the occasional errors, accidents in the form of occlusion, grounding, or fire have briefly shattered this complacency. These accidents have been the only moments when the visual screen is lifted, revealing the Bosphorus terrain as a zone of insecurity in the very heart of a dense and rapidly growing city. In contrast to offshore oil spills, which rely on techniques of visual imaging or technologies of the visible, as Peter Gallison and Carolyn Jones argue for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the accident at the Bosphorus presents an extremely immediate political visibility. So, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to present an exhibition project very quickly that I'm working on related to that research. The Strait project, an exhibition that will be opened in a month in South Gallery of Istanbul, brings this framework to architecture and urban imaginaries by manifesting the narrow strait through the tangible experience of the installation object. It introduces the idea of geographic object, an extrusion of the Bosphorus Strait shorelines to the height of the ceiling without articulating its actual topography. Yet, as an abstraction of geographic information, this object renders the Bosphorus simultaneously more tangible and more abstract. As an alternative to treating geographic information merely as data, Strait reenacts objectification and the role of spatial demarcation to articulate a more nuanced interaction between aesthetics and geography. The installation takes on the simultaneity of abstraction realism through its form, presenting an almost out-of-scale monolith from the street while turning into a more open and permeable structure within the interior space of the gallery. You're seeing the interior views and the current condition of the gallery. While the inner path of the object establishes an architecture connection to the narrowness of the Bosphorus Strait by scaling the tightest point in the strait to 90 centimeters, which is the bare minimum dimension of the door opening in architecture, the object renders the narrow Bosphorus as a constricted experiential condition. To amplify the contestation between the architectural and the geographic, the strait object reconstructs the crenulated shorelines of the Bosphorus through the further abstraction of locally used crown-molded profiles that are used as ornamentation within interior ceilings. By collapsing the vertical exclusion of a geographic information, in this case shorelines, with the horizontal exclusion of an ornamental profile, the abstraction of shorelines getting more tangible, yet still abstractly affecting the architectural scale. These are some references from architecture which I'm going to pass because of time that the project also relates to. In the exhibition, the installation object is presented through a humorous, yet a dark geographic fiction, illustrated through a series of speculative architectural drawings. Acting as a theoretical conjecture and a risky investment, both the fiction and their illustrations are slightly unfamiliar. That is, they take their cues from real events and facts in the world, but are slightly abstracted or defamiliarized in order to push the limits of imagination through speculative drawings. Resembling the realism that one can see in Edouard Manet's The Luncheon on the Grass, the narrative and representation of the installation project are real, with a slightly abstraction from the real. In the end, the installation object becomes a character of this particular dark narrative, which renders the object more tangible to the space of architecture. The story depicts an instance of 2025, when Oil the biggest oil tanker of the world, gets stuck in the Bosphorus. This incident not only blocks the passageway forever, but also causes the Bosphorus to be transformed into a new land of development. While some structures of the Bosphorus turn into touristic destinations depicting an archaeology of an oil shipping landscape, new developments take advantage of this rapidly urbanizing land. For new construction, building codes get created by taking Oil as a guideline, as the most historical structure, and monuments get built to commemorate previous oil spills on the spots that they have covered. So let me conclude with commenting on what exactly is the potential of a geohistorical, in this case, approach for architecture, and alternative environmental imaginations of these histories, in this case, a resource geography as I presented. By geohistorical, I mean an approach that situates itself between environmental history, urban history, and science and technology studies. I believe geohistory and its alternative representations matters immensely for architecture, so that we are able to understand the world and create alternative projections for it. So that we can transcend dichotomies such as nature and culture, national, international, urban versus wild urban, and further speculate the spatial framing of their dispositions. More specifically, I strongly believe that it is indeed only through these kinds of frameworks that architecture can disrupt the consensus on managerial and apocalyptic attitudes, while bringing these frameworks into public and disciplinary imaginaries. Rather than reducing environment's potential for architecture to systems and data, the true potential for geographic imagination in architecture for me is its ability to offer a renewed dialogue between environment and aesthetics. As an alternative to relying on prescriptive efficiency measures and management discourses of environmental science and technology, such frameworks have the potential to open up alternative trajectories for architecture scholarship and design experimentation that could build unprecedented relationships with eco-criticism, science and technology studies, and environmental history.